Repression is not the motivator of a social movement. Hope is the vision of winning is what motivates people.
Okay, welcome friends to our August monthly Zoom meeting of Take Action San Diego. So our agenda today is a pretty simple one, and that's we're going to hear from our guest speaker, Dr. Nelson Lichtenstein, and then after the Q&A, we'll just go over some upcoming actions and events you should be aware of. But the topic for today's talk, general strike, is one that I think, as many of us have gone through some large protests, some smaller marches and rallies, some letter writing, some phone calling, some canvassing. I think we all feel that we're in a period where we're asking, what else can we be doing? What else should we be doing? Um, because the situation isn't the one in where we have confidence necessarily that our institutions are going to reform themselves because we make some phone calls or write some letters. We need to be doing those things, but we need to be thinking about other things. And the concept of a general strike is one of the most powerful concepts that we can talk about, the most powerful activist things we can be doing. And I couldn't think of a better person to invite to talk to us about both the history and the impact of the general strike, but also where it fits in to what we do as activists now in this present moment and going forward. And just to give you a little background on Dr. Lichtenstein, we were extremely lucky to get him, and he's being very generous with his time. Some of you who read the New York Times or the LA Times may have come across his opinion pieces, his book reviews, but he's written, I think, 18 or 19 books, most of them on the topic of labor history and workers' rights movements. Two of those books, or actually three, I have listed here, and we will put the links in case you're interested in reading of them, in the chat, and I will also include links to those books in the follow-up email that I send to you. And one of those books, Why Unions Matter, is upcoming. It is not published yet, but Nelson was kind enough to share a chapter from that book with us. Most of you who signed up got the link to that chapter, and it is on the general strike. So it's a great one to be reading right now. And if you did not get that link, I will send it again in my follow-up email. But I think I will let you go, Nelson, now, and I will stop sharing my screen so that we can hear from you. And thank you again for being here.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it, and I'm delighted to be here. I look forward to the Q&A and that for sure. Well, I mean, I've written a book about contemporary trade unions and how they advance democracy. Nowhere more clearly than in those times and places where an authoritarian government holds sway. To do so, however, the unions and other progressive organizations have to transcend themselves. They move from being organizations that represent just a well-defined sector of the population to social movements that engender a vast new set of energies and aspirations. They open political and moral opportunities never before thought possible. And that is a large part of the reason that when dictators and reactionaries come to power, in the United States, as well as distant lands, they invariably attack the unions and other popular formations, either by destroying them outright or transforming these organizations into but an apparatus of the state. When Mussolini's fascists seized power in Italy in 1922, they outlawed strikes, persecuted union activists, and replaced independent unions with a set of government-controlled syndicates. In Nazi Germany, stormtroopers waited until the labor movement had finished its May Day parades in 1933 before they seized union headquarters, confiscated all monetary assets, and arrested prominent communist, social democrats, and union leaders, many of whom were imprisoned in Dachau or other concentration camps long before the Nazis began the roundup of Jews, Roma, and other targets of racial hatred. The defeat of fascism did not staunch this pattern when authoritarian regimes came to power in the post-war years. In Iran in 1953 and Guatemala the next year, the overthrow of the popular democratically elected governments led to the suppression of the trade union movement. The same thing happened when the military took over in South Korea in 1961, in Greece in 67, in Chile in 73, Pakistan in 77, and Egypt in 2013. Um, and the same was true for communist regimes in Eastern Europe. They claimed to speak in the name of the working class, but in fact they destroyed independent organizations of that class. Such regimes seek to eliminate trade union influence because of the very independence and power such organizations gave to large bodies of men and women who are strategically located in the economy or in the politics. Unions are an institutional platform from which to challenge regime prerogatives and realistically envision an alternative political system. Trade unions really are subversive when it comes to maintenance of authoritarian forms of government. They subvert authoritarianism. Conversely, general strikes almost always take place when the state breaks established democratic norms, using police or the military to crush a strike or manipulate an election. During the 19th century, in the US, virtually all strikes were effectively illegal. So the big railroad and coal strikes of that era often ended in pitched battles between the strikers and the National Guard. Sometimes the community and even the local police sided with the strikers, as in the great 1877 railroad strikes or the famous Battle of Blair Mountain in 1921 in West Virginia. These were general strikes because the industries of that time were so large and so pervasive that basically everyone was on strike and everyone had to choose a side on whose side you were. The next big series of general strikes came in the aftermath of World War I. Here, the Bolshevik Revolution, as well as the general discrediting of the old ruling classes on both sides of the Atlantic, gave to workers and others a sense of elan, and to their opponents a determination to crush the red beast. In Seattle and Winnipeg, post-war general strikes shut down entire cities. Likewise, in 1934, when a reformist national government, which gave encouragement to workers in Minneapolis and San Francisco, was counterposed in those cities to the utterly reactionary business class of both places. In those cities, Minneapolis and San Francisco, the local governments enlisted vigilantes and militia to try to crush the strikes of both longshoremen in San Francisco and truckers in Minneapolis. Let me make clear that general strikes don't have to emerge always from the ranks of labor. In 1946, the Oakland General Strike was called by the local labor movement when police escorted scab trucks across picket lines at downtown department stores, in which the women were composed the majority of the strikers there. But the strike turned into more than a labor dispute when it became clear that the fight was now between the community and a set of conservative politicians and their ally, the right-wing Oakland Tribune. Workers and neighbors were literally dancing in the Oakland streets for 2 or 3 days. They pulled jukeboxes out of the street, you know. In 1963, the March on Washington was a de facto general strike. It was held on a Wednesday, not a Saturday, a Wednesday, a work day, and shut down many workplaces from Washington, D.C. to New York. And many white federal employees stayed home in D.C., and the black federal employees came to the march. In 2006, the Day Without Immigrants was a Latino general strike, shutting down poultry plants and field work in California and the Midwest. Employers did not resist the tide, and even non-union workplaces were shut tight for that day. A similar kind of ethnic immigrant strike took place in 2017 to protest Trump's immigration policies. And then in early 2019, Sarah Nelson, head of the Flight Attendants Union, called for a general strike, at least of government employees, during Trump's shutdown of the government in that January. The call was heeded by enough air traffic controllers at the New York airports to shutter the system, after which Trump almost immediately caved. Today, Nelson is once again calling for a general strike. She says, nothing can move without our labor, and it's time to exercise our power in a as a united working class. We need to get ready for a general strike. And Sean Fain of the UAW wants a general strike too, calling on all unions to align their contracts so that they expire on May 1st, 2028. 142 years after a set of Chicago strikes on that same day of the month gave rise to the modern May Day festivals and demonstrations. In the time remaining, I want to outline two actual general strikes. The now classic 1934 San Francisco strike, and the second, 84 years later, the 2018 Red State Revolt, during which tens of thousands of public school teachers conducted a set of entirely illegal strikes in GOP-dominated West Virginia, Oklahoma, Arizona, Kentucky, and other conservative states. Despite the decades that separated these two upheavals, both social phenomena shared some strikingly similar characteristics. In both cases, unions and their supporters transformed themselves into popular and consequential social movements. In both instances, unions found themselves confronted by employers and opponents who enlisted the state on their side, either by rigging the system or through outright repression. In both instances, old leaders were repudiated, and in both strikes, new voices came to the fore, often among ideological radicals, socialists, communists, intellectuals of all sorts, whose influence had heretofore been of a marginal, seemingly utopian sort. And finally, these social movements had a profound impact on politics. Um, Abroad, such general strikes have sparked a transformation akin to an actual revolution, as in post-Franco Spain, Brazil, and South Korea after the rule of their militaries, South Africa in the fight against apartheid, and Poland during its transition away from the communist regime. In the US, it's not been that dramatic, but these changes have been consequential. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, when these social movements are at flood tide, multitudes of ordinary men and women glimpse a world transformed, a vision of solidarity and collective liberation. And that will stay with them for their entire lives. In San Francisco, a strike of longshoremen and sailors began in early May 1934, generating frequent conflicts with the police and strikebreakers on the Embarcadero, the broad street immediately adjacent to the various piers where their ships were docked and their cargo unloaded. Their leader was Harry Bridges, a former member of the Industrial Workers of the World, who in the 1930s was close to the communists. But he was hardly the only leftist in the union leadership, because the maritime trades have always been populated by cosmopolitan, radical young workers. The steadfastness of the striking workers brought most West Coast shipping to a halt. That enraged not only the steamship companies, but an increasingly recalcitrant business community. Led by bankers and merchants, the Industrial Association of San Francisco wanted to use the power of the state to crush the strike and eliminate Bridges and other union leftists. The longshore strike was turning into a transparently legible form of class conflict, with the governor, the mayor, the police, the newspapers, and all the big employers aching for a showdown. They were particularly alarmed because Bridges and other militants had successfully challenged the leadership of an older, more conservative set of longshore and Teamster union leaders. giving rise to the charge that the Reds were taking over the city. It is not exactly a law of labor history, but when unions turn into broad and ambitious social movements, the ouster of an older and more cautious group of leaders by a new and more insurgent cohort is almost always a high-profile part of the phenomena. Tensions reached a breaking point on the afternoon of July 5th, 1934, when, at the behest of the Industrial Association, hundreds of police made a big push to bludgeon picketers off the Embarcadero. At about 1:30 p.m. in the afternoon, they fired into a crowd near the strike headquarters, injuring at least 34 and killing one outright, with another found dead a few hours later. Um, Bridges wired President Roosevelt. Reign of Terror inaugurated at the behest of the Industrial Association. Hereafter, Bloody Thursday would be enshrined and memorialized in Longshore Union history. But then, at that time, Frank Merriman, the Republican governor of California, directed the state's National Guard to take over the port, citing the tumultuous, riotous, and unlawful assemblies of the striking longshoremen. By dawn on July 6, 2,000 troops were in place, with marksmen positioned atop the piers and machine gun nests guarding key locations. Kind of similar. Merriman thought the prospect of an even larger general strike challenged the authority and ability of the government to maintain itself, a product of destructive and subversive influences. Here we have all the combustibles for absolute repression of the union movement, with a powerful set of regional capitalists and California officials operating in near perfect tandem. But that deployment of all the potential violence a government has at its command also created the conditions for an even greater exhibition of working class solidarity and determination. It became manifest on July 9th, when as many as 40,000 longshoremen and their supporters silenced the city's commercial district in a mass funeral procession for the slain workers. The symbolism was extraordinary. The longshoremen, many war veterans, marched 8 and 10 abreast on Market Street, followed by the caskets on flatbed trucks. The police stayed out of sight, and bystanders doffed their hats as a newly awakened proletariat occupied the urban space heretofore reserved for bankers, merchants, and industrialists, accustomed to running the city's civic life. Quote, "It was a spectacular and stirring sight," wrote novelist Charles Norris, "as thousands of men and women, to the solemn cadences of Beethoven's dirge, silently followed the dead and the attendant trucks piled high with wreaths and floral tributes. Sidewalks were lined with women, children, and sober-faced men of every walk of life. Hours passed, and still the column moved onward. Tramp, 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 on the workers plodded, bareheaded, no talking, not even a cigarette. Tramp, 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 grave and grim, on they came. There seemed to be no end to the procession, a solid river of men and women. Paul Ilal, a spokesman for the Industrial Association, was forced to admit that events of the day were a brilliant and theatrical propaganda. But it was more than that. The working class had occupied the center of civic space, and shortly thereafter shut down virtually every enterprise in the city, unless the strike committee saw fit to open a restaurant or a hospital or a grocery store. This was dual power. For a few days, in which the formal political and police apparatus was forced to share governance with a well-organized and insurgent movement. Um, Eventually, the union won, and the longshoremen were established in the ILWU. But that's another. I'll get to that later on. I won't get to that. But that's another little story. The 1934 San Francisco general strike now seems like ancient history, but much of its aspiration and some of its radical character reappeared during the Red State Revolt, when thousands of public school teachers showed how a union protest can turn into a dynamic social movement. In West Virginia, where it all began, a gerrymandered legislature and billionaire governor were starving the public school system. The existing teacher unions were ineffective, and their lobbying expeditions to the state capitol an exercise in futility. Into this mix came two new forces: a set of young teachers radicalized by the Occupy movement, by the militant example provided by the Chicago Teachers Union, and perhaps most importantly, by activists politicized by the Bernie Sanders campaign. In the 2016 Democratic primary in West Virginia, he had won every county in the state. But there was more. There was also memory. Um, uh, uh, in Mingo County, which is in the southern part of the state, old center of mine worker militancy, there were no, but by 2018, there were no unionized miners left. But the tradition of the United Mine Workers militancy had not been extinguished among their offspring, many of whom were now school teachers. In West Virginia and other red states, the radical spark plugs did not have to convince teachers that they were getting a raw deal. That was a settled proposition. Rather, they broadened the imaginative horizon while at the same time taking concrete organizational steps to plan and carry forward the meetings, recruitments, and mobilizations necessary to make a mass strike possible. So you have these sort of Bernie Sanders radicals tended to be in Charleston, and the Mingo County teachers who were steeped in mine worker history, and together they came together to form a statewide strike. Virtually overnight, West Virginia was set politically ablaze, wrote Eric Black, who wrote a very good book on this on the whole subject. Job actions, PAC meetings, and other county walkouts proliferated. In a statewide strike vote, teachers endorsed a walkout in overwhelming numbers. Beginning on February 22nd, the strike mobilized 20,000 teachers and impacted 250,000 school children. Instead of fighting the walkout, almost every county school superintendent declared their schools closed, if only because they wanted higher funding as well. When it came to reopening, they consulted with union militants as to the appropriate date. Here was a bit of dual power taken from the general strike playbook. Almost. And as in San Francisco, existing union leaders were repudiated when they sought a premature compromise. When AFT President Christine Campbell appeared on the Capitol steps on the night of February 27th, and there was a huge crowd there, to announce that union officials had a quote handshake agreement with the governor and that the strike was over, she entirely misjudged the transformation of consciousness and the shift in real power the strike had evoked. From the crowd, numbering in the thousands, came shouts of fix it, now, and back to the table. The next day, meeting after meeting, teacher meeting, repudiated the back to work idea. Picket lines went up, and the strike continued for another hard fought week. West Virginia teachers did not win much. Some health insurance relief and a modest wage increase, but that was much more than the legislature or the governor had intended. And essentially, they humiliated those powers in the end. And this was also true in Arizona and Oklahoma and in parts of Kentucky, where the same kind of phenomena took place. So you have here examples of what can be done, what a general strike looks like, what it feels like, and I think it happens very often, not overnight. It's not spontaneous. It's planned. You have to think about it. You have to find the existing sources of strength. But when they come together and there's clearly a political, social, economic issue before you, which seems to have no other resolution, and the powers that be are seeking to crush you, I mean, then I think it's possible. And it's not just ancient history, not just the 30s, not just the late 19th century. We've seen it in the 21st century in a variety of ways, and it can be done again. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That was a great platform to start this out on, and really appreciate the depth of your knowledge on this and those examples, which I think really were an interesting contrast for different kinds of general strikes, and some that maybe we don't even think of as general strikes. So, had a lot of questions, which is great. Um, a few people, Karen and Dina, mentioned that the Teamsters did not endorse Kamala Harris in 2024. And as we know, not all unions and not all union members are liberal or certainly not progressive. So how do we see something like a general strike in our future when the labor movement itself isn't kind of all on the same page?
Right. Yeah. I mean, truck drivers are still very crucial to any kind of strike of that sort. Well, I mean, I would say O'Brien, of the head of the Teamsters, some union leaders can be idiosyncratic, and he did footsie up to Trump and et cetera. But here's the thing. The Teamsters Union is not O'Brien. It is actually relatively decentralized, and many of the Teamster locals in the Midwest and the West Coast, and other places too, and New York City, are quite militant. And if there was a social movement of any dimensions, they would come along. There's also an oppositional group inside the Teamsters, Teamsters for Democratic Union, which has played an extremely good role. So O'Brien, yes, he did. I mean, I think he was wrong, etc. But and he played footsie. I think he was also. There were, in fact, a lot of Trumpite Teamsters who were Trumpites. But being for Trump as a well, actually anybody, it doesn't have to be a worker, but anybody, doesn't necessarily mean that you're a kind of a conservative on all, markers. I mean, clearly one of the motivations for Trumpism is a kind of enraged hostility to the status quo. Anyway, I have no doubt that if in L.A. or any other Chicago for that matter these days, if there was a movement, there would be a fight within the Teamsters Union, and O'Brien doesn't have the power or even the will, for that matter, to dictate to the various regional locals, some of which are quite big. So that's been the case of the Teamsters Union for decades. It's not about right now. It's just even when Hoffa was running it, there were always other locals there that had a different point of view.
And kind of a follow-up question, I guess. Organized labor used to be a much broader movement in the country than it is now. There's certainly more workers that are not in unions
Yeah.
than are in unions. So in a future general
Right.
strike, are we just talking about unionized
No, no,
labor?
no, we aren't. That's a good question. I mean, the thing that today, which is so uh, dichotomous, is that the highest levels of support for trade union today in 60, 70 years, 70% are for unions, and 9 out of 10 young people. And so, but the union movement, you're right, is very small institutionally. Absolutely, that's the case. But the thing that happened in all these general strikes I mentioned, or big strikes, is that when they take place, all sorts of people finally they find a venue they can join in. I mean, you don't have to sign a card to be if there's a march down a street, or if there's a big picket line, or you're shutting down your local business or whatever it is. I mean, all the formal apparatus of the union movement is irrelevant. And this was true. Another time this was true was in the 1960s. We all remember the hard hat demonstrations, or some of us do, in New York, which were conservative, beating up hippies, anti-war demonstrators. But before that, what had happened in 69 and 70 is that lots and lots of white collar workers in New York City who were not in unions had, and in effect, gone on strike to protest the invasion of Cambodia and what Nixon was doing in Vietnam. So the thing about a general strike is it gets away from this issue of the smallness of the union movement and provides a venue for many, many more people to participate. That's what's good about it.
All right, that's great. Let's see. Th- That question, by the way, was from Caleb. This one's from Peter. How long could a general strike realistically last, given that people are struggling to pay their bills and fearful of losing their jobs? Assuming the answer is days and not months, wouldn't corporations just absorb the losses and move on?
That's true. It usually is days. Usually they are days. But I have to say one thing about don't be don't be defeatist. The questioners in the 2006, I'm in this particular, and I think 2006 Day Without Immigrants. It was being held on a work day, and there was some um, discussion. Oh, wait a minute. Oh, these poor Latino workers, working in kitchens and gardeners. They don't hold it on a weekday. They're gonna lose their salary. Let's have it on Saturday, where But when it comes to a strike of that proportion, of that political, social, emotional, moral dimensions, it becomes irrelevant whether you're going to lose a day's pay or not. It just does, and for the poorest people, and that's been true everywhere in the world and in America. And so I think I wrote a piece a few years ago called "No More Saturday Marches." In other words, it used to be all strikes were, and all demonstrations were strikes, and all strikes were demonstrations. And it's really my generation of students, student radicals, who say, "Oh, we don't want to lose our classroom. Let's have a demonstration on Saturday." And that was a mistake. A. Philip Randolph, who was an old unionist, he had the March on Washington on a Wednesday, and the Day Without Immigrants was on a weekday. And we should do that. That's what we should do. And I think that when you have that kind of a social movement, which by the way, of course, can also generate money and stuff for people who do need it. But one shouldn't use, I think it's a defeatist argument to say, oh, people won't come out because they need to earn their money.
All
And
right.
but
And
they do,
then,
yes. General strikes are generally for a few days. They're a kind of, and they, and then, that's true. If you want to have a revolution, then you have. I mean, that's what happened in Iran, and that's what happened in I think South Korea. I mean, you can have then you have an open-ended general strike. That turns into a revolution. We aren't talking that right now.
well, and that dovetails with another question. If a general strike is something that we're working towards, is violence necessarily a part of that?
No, I don't think so. No, and in fact, really big successful. I mean, unless you have the state or the Trumpites or whoever it is wants is a provocateur and wants violence to discredit it, and that often happens. But no, no, from the civil rights movement on, the anti-war movement. I mean, no, big demonstrations are actually their own protection against violence. I mean, the bigger it is, the less likely it's going to be violent because it sort of polices itself, and even people who some maybe there were some people who were into smashing a window or smashing a storefront or something. The big demonstration itself is a demonstration of power. You don't need it's a small demonstrations. It's sort of when things are tailing off. It's then people, oh, we got to throw a brick or something. No, I'm not worried about that unless the state itself seeks to, and that's what Trump is clearly, he's trying to do that. He tried to do that in LA. He's trying to do that in DC. That's unquestionably what he's trying to do right now.
Yeah. Um, so can you, a few questions also about kind of trying to imagine how something like this would evolve today.
Yeah.
And of course, nobody knows for sure, but maybe you could take us through a few possible scenarios for how general strike might actually emerge.
Well, that is a good question. I mean, and in one sense, there's always an incident of some sort. Usually the state intervenes in a very regressive and obviously unfair way, and that generates a response. I mean, there have been a number. I mean, the thing is that I mean, this is part of the problem we have today. Like, for example, Trump has abrogated the union contracts of many, government workers. So, well, why aren't we having a general strike of government workers in D.C.? Well, sometimes the spirit isn't there to move you. Repression is not the motivator of a social movement. The vision of winning is what motivates people, not repression. Repression just you just uh, dig further into your hole. And so we need both that sense of hope, and then at the same time, yeah, some obvious thing that the state is doing now. You know, um, uh, I mean, I don't know. This is. I'm not sure this resonates with millions of people, but it's quite the NLRB may quite possibly be abrogated. And this is an important institution that unions and wannabe unionists have used for decades, or when the arrest of meat Latino meatpacking workers or chicken, this kind of thing, I think could give rise to a kind of a response. I mean, fighting back against the ICE agents. I mean, and these they're going to workplaces. I mean, I can't tell you what incident it could be, but we know from history, whether it was various instances, spark this kind of movement, and then you need to organize it. Nothing happens spontaneously, but there are people, and I imagine people on this webinar are the kind of people who would be the organizers, and you need organizations, and you need to think about it. And actually, this is a very good thing. I don't know if there are discussions of how we have a general strike, and this is good. We're thinking about it, and and seeing what are the problems, and how would you enlist not just the unions? And I want to make that clear. There are all sorts of popular organizations, anti-poverty groups, all sorts of groups, and I think I don't know what it could be, but I can imagine when I think Trump's occupation of these cities is getting to be more than an irritant, and this could spark something, where you have basically we're shutting it down. And by the way, it's sort of happening in D.C. They're all, I mean, undocumented immigrants are not going to work. I mean, so it's already kind of, it's sort of happening, in a way.
Let's see. I think more than one person also, I think Wayne was one of them, is asking how important is it to have one key singular message or demand, or can it just be general, like, we hate what's going on?
Yeah,
And what would be
yeah,
a potential demand
yeah.
in a general strike?
Well, good question. I mean, obviously, I can't, answer that in a dictatorial fashion. Uh, um, I, I mean, just my opinion would be of my own that there was when we have had demonstrations in recent years where there were a multitude of demands, often sort of flowing from the various groups and et cetera who joined it. That did diminish the thrust of it. And so I do think, I mean, clearly one demand, and I think this is, democracy. I mean, we see, the general strikes are more than for a wage increase. That they're therefore they're for the recognition of sort of the independence and the voice of well, unions, but other people as well. So really, democracy is clearly on the line. That's clearly an issue which is transcends all sorts of political boundaries, and I think that's one of the centerpieces of such a general strike today.
Let's see.
But that's a decision to be made. You have to have meetings, you have to have discussions, you have to have, that's not for anyone to say.
Well, and I will interject just for a second, and then we'll go back to people's questions. But I think that one of the things that's happening in San Diego, and I think in other places as well, is that on Labor Day, for the first time, The pro-democracy kind of
Yeah,
progressive movement, the
yeah,
indivisibles and the swing lefts have joined together with organized labor to
yeah,
plan a day of action. And even though we have been working together loosely over this last year or more, this is really the first time that we're really integrated and working together closely. And I think that is the first step. Because I think all of those bodies, organized labor, undocumented, immigrant rights groups, pro-democracy groups are all going to have to be
yeah,
involved in this. And it's why I think this Labor Day is such an important
yeah,
event.
yeah.
Um, Let me just go on to, well, yeah, sort of from Deirdre, some of us are retired. How do retired people or, people who are not working support a general strike?
Oh, well, actually, I mean, again, such a an event, such a strike, such a mobilization. Um, the the yes, you shut your you're closing down a workplace. People are leaving it. That's part of it. But there's so much else to do in terms of mobilizing people. People who are more marginal to this. I mean, and that's why also everyone from teenagers in school to older people can be involved. I mean, when you think about, I mean, the schools also, by the way, if you had it, you would be shut down. I mean, the school, and we've seen movements of school children, going into middle school, shutting down. I mean, that's a huge resource. I mean, King did that, in Birmingham. They shut down the schools, and I think that would clearly be part of this. I mean, there'll be obviously places for people you want to be you want to be manifest, you want to be visible, you want to sort of take over the center, whatever is this the space that the opposition occupies. I mean, I think that was so clear in San Francisco in 34, and I didn't really talk about the what it felt like to be on the steps of the Capitol in West Virginia or Arizona in 2008. It was kind of a liberatory experience. It was kind of a transcendent moment, and people remember that. And I would also say that these kind of events, I mean, people they will change people forever, and that's a good thing. That even if they succeed or fail, they will change people forever.
All right, maybe just one more question and sort of follows up from what you're saying. Um, how do economic boycotts fit in? Are they part of that process? And is that a way that maybe people who don't work can
Yeah.
amplify the demands of a general strike?
Yeah, I mean, if you actually had a general strike, then obviously you would be boycotting the products that you more than you boycott you'd be calling on stores to shut down. I mean, you'd be yeah, and putting moral pressure. You'd have to have a. It's not like being thuggish. You just have it has to be kind of moral pressure that this is so important that you should be shutting down. And that did happen with the I mean in the Latino community. That happened. Restaurants and all sorts of the small entrepreneurs and this and that. They were shutting down. Just in Israel, by the way, just a week, well, 5 days ago, when they had this big, they actually it was interesting. The Histadrut, the Jewish labor federation, which is I don't know probably kind of stolid and conservative these days. They didn't agree to but other social forces in the country called a general strike to get the hostages home and to end the war. And people were walking neighborhoods and found stores that close it down for this day. And there was a lot of that kind of moral pressure. I think that's nothing is I'm in favor of that. You can explain. You don't do any. You don't beat anyone up. You just say you should close this down today. And that actually that Israeli strike is a good example of something that it wasn't labor. Well, labor didn't instigate it. It was people, others did, but it was a strike. It did shut down.
Yeah, that just happened. Okay, one more question.
Yeah.
Where does the Democratic Party fit in?
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, I said I could have gone on. Bernie did have a huge impact. He just did on a generation of people, and they had kind of that. There was no doubt about that. I mean, the clearly the my view is that the key thing to fighting Trumpism is mobile side and not and the Democrats haven't been able to do that in part because of cross currents. The Gaza thing is such a big cross current, and also the influence of certain elements of the high finance and such. And I think Kamala Harris was caught up in that, and that kind of paralyzed her in a way. And so since I'm in favor of mobilization, I think this guy Mandami, he seemed to do it in New York City, and I think it needs to be done other places. I mean, yeah. I mean, let me say this: if there was a social movement of a certain sort, and when Thane had when the UAW had a strike, and it wasn't a general strike, but it was a strike of all the auto industry, all the auto companies, not just one. And the UAW had not endorsed Biden. In fact, he was demanding things, but Biden showed up anyway on the picket line. So when you have a movement and you're doing things, the Democrats will move.
Okay, we have to lead and they will follow. Yeah,
Yeah.
okay. Well, I think that's a good note to end on, and we appreciate so much all of this information and good food for thought, and we'll see where we go. But I think this really helps us as we go forward. So thank you very much.
You're welcome indeed.